But in the meantime, please make friends with the people next to you, chat with them, see where they're from. Also, I'll take this opportunity to thank all the people that I always thank. So, of course, we thank Vermont Humanities Council, and we will thank the Vermont Department of Libraries, which underwrites the statewide program. Our series is underwritten by Chroma Technology. So, and then I'm going to list our library sponsors, and please, if you see them, if you use their products, let them know how much you appreciate this. So we have Against the Grain, Brattleboro Auto Body and Detailing, Brattleboro Retreat, Everyone's Books, GPI Construction, who did our renovation, so that's nice that they're sponsoring us. New Chapter, the Richards Group, the Vermont Country Store, Wyndham World Affairs Council, and of course, your friends and mine, the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library. So where would we be without them? And then also, yes, and so we're almost there. Chat among yourselves, warm up, and we'll be on the road soon.
We won't keep you waiting much longer. I'm Ryan Neuswanger. I'm the Director of Communications at Vermont Humanities. And I had this very long speech written out about the importance of signing up using the iPads, but I've seen you've mostly already done that, so thanks so much for doing that. If you did that last time, you got an email from us the day after the event and you were able to put in your feedback. It was amazing when we did it last month at about 5 different locations. I think about 50 people gave us very detailed feedback about their thoughts about the various talks, all of which is immensely helpful for us and for the Brooks Memorial Library. So thanks for your patience. I won't keep you much longer. I did just want to introduce Kate O'Neill, who we're very happy to have here from Philadelphia. Kate is a writer. She's currently working on a year-long series about the opioid epidemic for 7 Days newspaper. I assume some of you have been reading those amazing and moving articles. She's also working on a memoir about her sister, Madelyn Linsenmeir, who struggled with opioid addiction for more than a decade. She lives in Philadelphia with her partner and stepdaughter. So without further ado, here's Kate. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I was a little bit nervous. It was just going to be me and my mom, so I'm really glad you're all here. And thank you for being patient during the technical difficulties, which may or may not be over. We'll see. I'm going to start tonight, well, first of all, also acknowledging that I really love Brattleboro. I grew up in Burlington, and I've spent some time here because my sister has spent time at the Brattleboro Retreat, but also I've been doing some reporting down here about a town called Wilmington, over the mountain, and it's just a really lovely part of the state, and you've got such a great climate. But I want to start with a disclaimer, which might not bode that well. But I want to begin by saying that I'm not a public speaker. I'm a writer, and so I'm used to spending a lot of time by myself with literally earplugs in so I can't hear my 6-year-old, or listening to other people's stories. I'm not used to standing up and talking to strangers. So I have a lot of notes, and I might just have to read my notes. I might lose my train of thought, or that train might just go off the tracks entirely. And another thing I should warn you of that is I'm a crier, so there might be crying, but maybe not, I don't know. But the last disclaimer of the night, I hope, is that I am not an expert on addiction. I'm not, professionally or personally. I'm not a doctor or a social worker, and I feel really lucky to not personally have substance use issues. What I am is one of the millions of people who love someone with opioid use disorder. We are many, and we are growing, along with the number of people who have this disease. In 2016, more than 2 million people in the US had an opioid use disorder, which I think is a number that's probably grown pretty significantly since then. Last year, the American Psychiatric Association did a poll and found that nearly 1 in 3 Americans knows someone with opioid use disorder. So that means that at least a third of us in this room knows someone with opioid use disorder. And I would argue that all of us know somebody with some kind of substance use disorder, right? Whether it's opioids or alcohol. And I'll bet many of us love or loved someone with this disease. So that's my expertise. It's the same that I imagine a lot of you have. Loving one of the millions of people with opioid use disorder. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. My experience loving my sister who was addicted to opioids. I wanted to clarify a few terms to start off with that I'm going to use tonight. I use the term opioid. You hear opiate a lot, and just I wasn't aware until recently that an opiate is a drug that's naturally derived from the opium poppy plant, so that includes things like heroin and morphine and codeine. Opioid is a broader term, and it includes opioids, but it also includes synthetic opioids. Sorry, it includes opiates, but it also includes synthetic opioids, which are not naturally derived. And examples of that are hydrocodone, which is sold as Vicodin, oxycodone, which is the ingredient in OxyContin, as well as fentanyl, which is a very powerful opioid that people say is about 50 times stronger than heroin, and is that sort of infiltrated the drug supply. I use the term opioid use disorder for the most part, and the reason that I do that is that it's a disease, and this is the term that's used in the manual that doctors use to diagnose this disease. It's the same thing as opioid addiction, but just to emphasize the fact that this is a disease, I generally use the term opioid use disorder. There are some terms that I do avoid. You'll hear me say person with opioid use disorder, and when I say that, I think that's maybe the term some people would equate with drug addict or heroin addict. So those are terms that I avoid, and I'll talk a little bit later about the importance of language and why I use certain terms and not others. And then the last term that you'll hear is medication-assisted treatment, and that just refers to the medication that is used to treat opioid use disorder. I'm not really sure why they call it medication-assisted treatment, because when they give you insulin for diabetes, they just call it your medication. But it's called medication-assisted treatment. There's a couple of drugs, methadone, buprenorphine, and these are really the standard of care for people with opioid use disorder. So that's basically the terminology I'm going to be referring to that might be unfamiliar while I tell this love story, as I call it. So I'm going to start at the beginning with the first time that I fell in love. I was 16 years old, and it was definitely love at first sight. I remember walking into the hospital room in the maternity ward, and there she was, the object of my affection, asleep in a bassinet next to her mom, my sister Madeline, who I thought was the most beautiful baby in the world. When I look at that photo now, I'm like, she's actually a little splotchy and rashy, but at the time, I thought she was perfect. And she was, in fact, perfect. To tell this love story, I'm going to have to talk about some of the 11,148 days that came after that one. The day I fell in love for the first time, the day my sister was born. But part of me would just like to end there. I had a sister, and she was perfect. Because by the time she died, so many people, including Maddie herself, saw my sister as broken. And it's true that her addiction did, in many ways, break her. But she was also perfect, and we would give anything for more of those days. And now you know that I'm about to subject you to a family photo slideshow. The reason I put this photo up is because I just think it's emblematic of who Maddie is. This is her. She has a lemonade stand at the end of our street, and it's your kind of typical lemonade stand sign. She says lemonade 50 cents. She's got some good marketing. It's yummy. But over there in the corner of this picture, I don't know if you can see it, she says, "I love you people." And I just think that exemplifies who Maddie was. She loved you people. She could and would talk to anyone. She loved to act and be on stage. She had a beautiful singing voice, and I have two sisters. I have another sister, Maura, who's much closer to me in age, and she would get so mad at me if she knew I was saying this, but Maura always says that if we weren't sisters, we wouldn't be friends, because we're just really different. We talk to each other on the phone every single day, but I'm not sure we would have found each other in this world. If I wasn't related to Maddie, I would have wanted to be her friend. She's the kind of person you want to sit next to at a party. She's the kind of person who starts talking to you on the bus, and you're actually glad, not scared. So obviously I could talk all night about how much I love my sister, but honestly, she's so unique and special to me and to my family, but she's not unique. You all have a Maddie. You have somebody who's, you know, that you're close to in that way and you love in that way. And, you know, I'm not really here to talk about how and why I love her. I'm here to talk about the fact that my sister also fell in love when she was 16 years old. The first time Maddie fell in love, it was not with a baby or a boy or a girl she met at school. She fell in love with a pill she took at a party. She was 16 years old the first time she took OxyContin, and she fell in love with the way that pill made her feel. So she continued to take oxys, as they're called, until she had developed an addiction that she could no longer satisfy with expensive black market pills, and she began using heroin. My family had no idea what was going on. Maddie started to get into some trouble. She was smoking pot. She wasn't doing well in school. But my sister Maura and I were terrible teenagers. I dropped out of high school. My sister Maura did all the drugs. So I think there was a sense, you know, my parents were intervening, but I think there was a sense that she would grow out of this. We had grown out of it, but she didn't grow out of it. Maddie was 20 when my mom found her works beneath the bathroom sink. So it was the syringe she used to inject drugs and the spoon she used to dissolve the heroin. And with that discovery began a decade-long nightmare that ended with my sister's death last year. I refer to it as a nightmare, but it's a nightmare that really changes shape over time. I think this is one of the things about addiction that I didn't understand at the beginning, because at the beginning there's all of this drama and urgency and action, and after a while, it becomes this kind of drudgery, I think, both for the person who's addicted and for the family. You can't sort of react the same way in year 1 as you do in year 10. And there's always this fear underlying everything, and there's, you know, that cliche of the phone ringing and you're worried that somebody's calling to tell you that, you know, she OD'd and somebody dumped her body in front of the ER, or she was murdered and they found her body in a ditch. But what you actually get are all these other phone calls. Hey, I need a ride to rehab. Hey, I'm in jail. I need bail. Hey, I've been kicked out of rehab. Can you come pick me up? Hey, I've been kicked out of the sober house. I'm in the hospital. Those are the phone calls you're actually getting. And it's also, I think, drudgery for the person who has addiction. You know, watching my sister, it was like this, you know, I think for a long time, not for a long time, but at the beginning I had this understanding of her addiction as she was like getting high, and it seemed like, you know, almost like she was partying or something like that. What she was doing was trying not to be sick. I mean, she used not to be sick. And so I think there was this, you know, like everybody else has the grind of their job. When you're addicted, the grind was getting up, doing what she needed to do to get the money, to get drugs, and so that was the drudgery for her. My mom and I were talking recently about, I don't know if you've heard of, people talk about the 5 stages of grief, and we were saying, you know, they're like denial and acceptance and anger or something. And we were saying there should be a 6th stage of grief, which is regret. Because since my sister died, I have felt such profound regret about the things that I didn't know about addiction when she was alive. And one of the things I most, and I think that's really a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, are the things that I've learned and that I wish I had known when she was alive. In the past year and the past couple months, especially in the lead up to the anniversary of her death, I've really wished that I had a time machine so I could go back and do things differently, knowing what I know now. And then I think, okay, maybe this information can be a time machine for somebody else's family so that they're not wishing that they could go back, that they instead are having this information going forward and can do things differently. So one of the things that I really wish I had known early on in my sister's addiction was that on average, this is according to John Kelly, who's a doctor and Harvard researcher, on average, it takes a person with opioid use disorder 8 years and 4 to 5 treatment attempts to achieve 1 year of remission from their disease. I had no idea. I mean, that's a long time. I didn't really know any statistics or have any information when my sister first started using drugs. We knew she was using heroin, which was like 11 years ago. And none of the systems and institutions that she passed through as a result of her disease seemed to know this fact either, that it would take her 8 years and 4 to 5 attempts at treatment, if she was lucky, if she was average, to achieve 1 year of sobriety. And I think those systems and institutions still don't reflect this fact. There seemed to be an expectation on the part of virtually every person and every system, including my family, that my sister immediately get and stay sober, and that anything short of that was a failure on her part. The other thing that I wish we had known about was medication-assisted treatment, which is what I was talking about before. Buprenorphine and methadone, which are two forms of medication-assisted treatment, they reduce, you're 50% less likely to die if you have opioid use disorder and you are on MAT. So I had no idea even what these medications were when my sister first started going into treatment. And she would go to rehab after rehab, and if she was lucky enough to go to a place that offered medication, they would usually just use it to detox her. So they would use it while they were there. She would give her buprenorphine, and then when she was done, she would leave. If she was lucky enough to go to a place that understood this was good long-term treatment for people with opioid use disorder, it was impossible to find a practitioner who would prescribe to her when she got out. It's still hard to get these medications. Doctors can prescribe, if you're an MD, as far as I know, you can prescribe virtually any drug. You can definitely prescribe opioid use, based painkillers with abandon, but to prescribe buprenorphine, you have to get a waiver. You have to do an 8-hour training. So they've created this really big barrier, and there's, extra scrutiny for these doctors. Methadone can only be dispensed at federally regulated clinics. Only a third of addiction programs offer them. But at the time, we didn't even know that this was a really good thing for our sister to be on, so we weren't focused on it. We weren't pushing for it. We weren't advocating for it. And a lot of the, most of what we were learning from these rehabs she was going to that were, a lot of which were abstinence-based, meaning, they didn't advocate for using anything. And they would refer to MAT as a crutch. And I talked to a doctor named Peter Park, who is actually from Wilmington this year, and he had the best response, I thought, to the fact that people refer to medication-assisted treatment as a crutch. He said, that's the perfect analogy. It's a crutch. You break your leg, we put a cast on you, you're non-weight-bearing on crutches until your bone heals, and then we remove the cast and you get off your crutches. Duh. I don't know why that's a criticism. It's a crutch, great. But at the time, that was, there was this really negative perception, and people would say that if you were on medication, you weren't clean. So my family would drop everything to drive my sister to the same 14-day rehab that she'd been to twice before and hadn't worked. But we weren't pushing for her to get medication. We were just pushing her to be, quote, clean. And in the absence of meaningful treatment, my sister didn't get clean. Her addiction intensified, and so did the things she did in its name. She did all the things. She stole from her family and from strangers. She trafficked and dealt drugs. She traded sex for drugs and money. And so many horrible things happened to her as well. She was arrested and incarcerated multiple times, including at Rikers Island in New York. She contracted hepatitis C from injecting drugs. She was sex trafficked twice that my family knows of. And we just did not know how to help her. We really only knew of one option, and that was rehab. So we supported her to go to rehab again and again and again and again and again and again. We watched as these rehabs didn't work. And the other thing we did was love her. I am not religious, but I believe in love the way I think other people believe in God or Allah or science or medicine. I do believe in science and medicine as well, don't worry. But I believe that all of these things have the power to transform and to heal. And I think I really believed that if I loved my sister enough, she wouldn't die. If I could love her enough, she would not just survive. She would make the life for herself that I knew she could have, a life where she was sober and happy and stable and safe. My family and I pushed her to have that life. We pushed her to be the person we knew she could be, and anything short of that we kind of viewed as failure. She came close to that life many times. The closest was after she had her son, Aiden. She tried so hard to stay sober after she had him, harder than I've ever seen anyone try anything. But as anyone who's had a baby knows, There is so much pressure, and it's exhausting. And she also had all of this trauma that wasn't being addressed. And in hindsight, I realized she must have had terrible PTSD. And then on top of having a baby, she was also having to get to the clinic to get her medication because that's where it was dispensed. She had transportation issues, and then things that I think seemed so simple to the rest of us, like grocery shopping and managing a bank account, were things she had just really never done in her adult life because she'd spent it in the throes of this disease. But we and all of these systems that she was interacting with basically expected her to go from being homeless because of injection drug use to functionally parenting a special needs kid. And not shockingly, it didn't work. She relapsed for the first time when Aiden was 6 months old. He went to live with our sister Maura. She went to rehab, got sober, got on track as quickly as she could. She got on track very quickly, but DCF, things moved pretty slowly. So it was 6 months before she got her son back. And then she and her son and her partner had a year of, I think, was probably the best year of her adult life. She loved that child so much, and just, mothering transformed her. I think loving someone the way she loved him transformed her. But they relapsed 11 months later, and with DCF, when you relapse a second time, I think of a young child, they really want to now have that child have some quote-unquote permanency. And so this time when she lost custody, the state moved to terminate her parental rights so he could be adopted. And that eventually happened. She terminated her own parental rights, and within 5 months, she had died of a heart infection called endocarditis while incarcerated in Springfield, Massachusetts. So after Maddie died, my family decided that we would, be honest about her story in her obituary, and we did that for a few reasons. Part of it was because we had just seen, including in the hospital while she was dying, just the stigma and judgment on the part of doctors is really intense, and we wanted to help reduce that for people. We also, until the second my sister drew her last breath, I fully believed she would survive, and so I think we wanted to extend the hope that we had for Maddie for other people who have this addiction. And we also wanted to ask people who work in these systems for empathy and to show compassion and treat people with addiction with dignity. My family paid to place the obituary in a couple of newspapers, the Burlington Free Press and 7 Days, which is the alternative weekly in Burlington. And my sister Maura and I put it on Facebook because we thought, Maddie's friends aren't going to read the paper and our friends don't read the paper. And a friend of mine tweeted it, and then a writer from the New York Times retweeted it, and then it went viral. And it's now been viewed by it's been viewed more than 4 million times on the 7 Days website alone. And I've been asked so many times why I think it went viral or what about it spoke to people. And I just don't have an answer for other people, but what I do know is that in spite of the fact that my sister's struggle was part of a national epidemic, I felt terribly alone when she was sick. I think my family, we all felt terribly alone, and I know that Maddie felt terribly alone. I knew intellectually that what we were going through was being experienced by millions of others, but it still felt so lonely. I told you. Until she died. So what I think that obituary did was it served as a form of connection for people. I don't know why it went viral or what it did for other people, but it served as a form of connection for me and for my family. It was this realization that we are not alone. This is happening to our brothers and sisters and mothers and sons, to our coworkers and neighbors and best friends. Even if you are one of the 2 out of 3 people who doesn't believe you know somebody with this particular disease, opioid use disorder, addiction touches everyone. And I think there was something about Maddie's obituary that was a reminder of that. This is happening to all of us. We are not alone. So 7 Days, that alternative weekly newspaper that all of a sudden had people flooding its website. I believe its website actually crashed. So this paid ad, you know, an obituary is a paid ad for a newspaper, had exponentially more volume than any of its content, you know, that it produces and has produced for years. So I think they realized, you know, that there was an appetite for these kinds of stories, and they invited me to spend a year covering the opioid epidemic in Vermont. Nearing the end of that year right now. I'm not a journalist or a reporter. I was working in communications at a tech company when my sister died, and I have learned so much of this year. I mean, and you know, everything that I've learned is, you know, it's all the things that I wish I had known when my sister was alive. I've talked to people all over the state. I've covered issues that my sister experienced personally, like sex trafficking, using opioids while pregnant, DCF. I've also covered things that, you know, she didn't experience, like what it's like to be in a rural community and have addiction. You know, I talk to people who have addiction. I also talk to doctors and lawyers and social workers and rehab directors and scientists. I talk to families, and you know, I noticed that everybody's story is unique, what they're working on is unique, but you know, virtually everybody, the one thing that was in common to virtually all of these conversations was stigma. Everyone talked about stigma and shame and judgment. People who are experiencing it personally because they have addiction, people who are working with people who have addiction are witnessing how the stigma impacts them. Stigma is such a big deal when it comes to opioid use disorder that the American Medical Association made, quote, removing stigma one of 6 actions that physicians could take to end the opioid epidemic. And when I think about stigma, I think so much about language. You know, I am a writer, and language is so important. And so this is sort of going back to what I was talking about at the beginning. The WHO recently listed, like, it was a list of the most stigmatized diseases, and opioid use disorder was the first one. But language is really important around it, because how we refer to people doesn't just impact how they feel, it impacts how they're treated. So a study at the Recovery Research Institute, which is out of Mass General in Boston, asked participants how they felt about 2 people who were, quote, actively using drugs and alcohol. And one person was referred to as a, quote, substance abuser, and the other person was referred to as, quote, having a substance use disorder. They were given no other information about these individuals. And this is what's called person-first language. So a substance abuser is somebody who's being defined by their disease, right? That's what you are. You're somebody who abuses substance. When you say a person having substance use disorder, that's one element of who they are. So you have substance use disorder, and you're also really funny, and you're bad at math, and you like chocolate, right? So this is one element of who you are. But what this study found was that participants believed that the, quote, substance abuser was much less likely to benefit from treatment and more likely to benefit from punishment than the person with substance use disorder. They believed that the substance abuser was more likely to be socially threatening. They believed they were more likely to blame the substance abuser for any problems they had related to their disease, and they were more likely to believe that the substance abuser should be able to fix their problem without help, which is nuts. I mean, this is based on some words. The other thing that's nuts is that half of the people in this study work in healthcare. I mean, these are people who should know better. And these are people who people with opioid use disorder are going to for help. Numerous studies have shown that stigma is a barrier to people getting medical and social services, as well as treatment for their disease. So stigma is literally killing people. And which brings me back to this fact. So people that I talk to who work professionally with people with opioid use disorder, they love to use this term, we're gonna meet people where they're at, which I think is a really important thing, looking at where people are in their disease cycle, treating them with dignity no matter what. But the fact is that this is a disease, and we know it takes people 8 years to achieve 1 year of remission from this disease. So that means that for a good part of those 8 years, people are going to be actively using drugs. So how do we keep them safe during that time? How do we meet them where they're at when where they're at is actively using drugs? Which is a hugely dangerous activity. 130 people die every day in the United States from ODing on opioids. And for the first time in US history, you're more likely to die of an opioid OD than in a car crash. Those stats don't even include people like my sister, who, like I said, died of a heart infection, or the many other people who die of related causes, not from an overdose, or the people who live in misery every single day. So if we know that people are going to be using drugs for a lot of this time that on average it takes to get sober, how are we really going to meet them where they're at? And this brings me to another thing that I really wish I had known about when my sister was alive. And it's something that's called harm reduction. Again, I feel like I'm revealing to you what an idiot I was before a year ago, but I had literally never heard of the term harm reduction before my sister died. It's actually something that we all engage in, or we hopefully all engage in every single time we get in our car. You put on your seatbelt, right? That's harm reduction. You still might get in a crash, you still might be killed in a crash, you might get hurt in a crash, but you put on the seatbelt as a way to reduce the potential for harm. And it's the same thing with drug use. Harm reduction is a way, okay, this is a really dangerous thing that people are doing, how are we going to reduce the potential harm around it? And it's, a public health movement in a lot of ways. I think some people think there are social justice components to it, but there's a lot of principles around harm reduction. And these were a few that were really important to me in my understanding of harm reduction when I first started learning about it. Harm reduction accepts, for better or for worse, that drug use is part of our world. Rather than ignore it or condemn it, it's happening. So how do we minimize the harmful effects of that drug use? It also acknowledges that there's a continuum of behaviors related to drug use, right? So you've got total abstinence over here. I don't touch a drop or snort a speck of anything ever, to really severe addiction over here. And there's also ways of using drugs that are clearly safer than others. So if you're thinking about opioids, using a prescription opioid pill is probably the safest, swallowing it is probably the safest way to use an opioid. You can still OD, and people do all the time, but it's, you know exactly what's in there. It's a regulated substance. If you crush and snort that pill, it's a little more dangerous, right? Because now it's more potent, it's going more directly to your bloodstream, more dangerous to use. If you snort heroin, that's more dangerous still, because when you buy heroin off the street, you have no idea what you're really buying, right? I talked before about fentanyl, which is 50 times stronger than heroin. Carfentanil is another drug that's infiltrated and is used to cut heroin, and that's 5,000 times more potent. And that's why a lot of people believe people are out ODing at such a crazy rate right now. So that's more dangerous still. Now you're using a substance, you have no idea what it is. But there's a way to mitigate some of that harm, right? There's test strips that you can use to test your drugs, see how potent they are, and make decisions, okay, I'm not going to use this much because it'll kill me. Injecting heroin is more dangerous still than snorting it. If you use syringes that are not sterile, if you don't swab your skin, you can get disease, you can get abscesses. But again, there's a way to mitigate that harm. You can help by providing people with sterile equipment. You can make sure that people have Narcan so that, and that goes for all of the opioid use. Narcan, which is the opioid overdose reversing drug. So that's sort of the second principle of harm reduction that I thought was really important. And the last that I think really changed my thinking about it was that it doesn't condone or encourage using drugs, which I think is how I would have thought about it in the past when I was thinking about my sister. Like, well, if you're giving her, sterile syringes, or that's encouraging her. But it's not doing that at all. It's not attempting to minimize the harm of drug use or ignore it, or the danger to people who use drugs, or the communities in which they live in. It's actually just to reduce that harm. So these are some examples of harm reduction. The first is medication-assisted treatment, which we talked about before, and that can be used to help people abstain from using illicit opioids, but it can also be used when people are actively using opioids. And this was something I didn't understand either. So John Brooklyn, who's the director of the Chittenden Clinic in Chittenden County, which is sort of the first methadone clinic in the state, he said, if he's got a patient, and they've got thousands of patients, and a lot of them are using drugs while they're on buprenorphine, and his theory is, okay, so if somebody's injecting drugs 3 times a day, 7 days a week, and they get on buprenorphine, and maybe now they don't inject drugs Monday through Friday, they go to work, and they're only using drugs on the weekend, that has hugely reduced their risk of getting an infection from injecting, of overdosing. So that is a form of harm reduction. Another form of harm reduction is Narcan, and this is Narcan. 2, always carry 2. This is the overdose reversing drug. So carrying this, if you use drugs, if you use opioids, is really important. They say, don't use alone. So this is an example of harm reduction, carrying it. And the health commissioner in Vermont has issued a blanket prescription, so any Vermonter can go into any pharmacy and get Narcan, and you should. I live in Philadelphia, and like 3 or 4 days ago, somebody OD'd on a train platform, and there were literally 2 bike cops there who did not have Narcan, and somebody else on the train platform did have it and revive them. But the other thing, these other 2 I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about, and one of them is called syringe services programs. I don't know why they give these things such complicated, unsnappy names. So syringe services programs and supervised consumption sites. I want to rename these things. So syringe services programs do a few things. I didn't know what they were. I think that before my sister died, and I learned so much this past year, I'd heard of needle exchanges, which I thought was a place people could go get clean needles, as I was calling them at the time, which they are, but they're also so much more. Syringe services programs are places that people can get those test strips where I was talking about. They can get Narcan. They can get tested for HIV and hepatitis C. They can get referrals to rehab or to a doctor or for mental health care. It wasn't until I started interviewing people for stories this year that I learned about the program in Burlington, which is the city where my sister lived. I did not know about the syringe services program in the city where my sister, who was an injection drug user, lived. It's called Safe Recovery, and as I talk to people across the state, so they have clients from every county in Vermont who come up there. And people again and again would say this is the one place when they were actively using drugs where they felt safe and cared for and not at all judged. It was literally the only place where they felt loved. My sister died of endocarditis. Clean syringes and alcohol swabs literally could have saved her life. I would give anything to have, instead of been carting her to rehab after rehab, have a conversation with her where I said, hey, if you're going to be using right now, can you just, do you know about Safe Recovery, which I'm sure she knew about, and how are you going to stay safe? How are you taking care of yourself? But these are some of the things that syringe services programs do, which I was not aware of and which were kind of surprising to me. They actually reduce drug use. People who use syringe services programs are 5 times more likely to enter treatment and more likely to reduce or stop injecting drugs, which seems counterintuitive, but when I talk to people in Vermont, it actually makes sense. When people are feeling so isolated and disconnected and judged by their doctor, and then they have this place where they can go and they feel safe and they have these people that they have a relationship and they talk to. So many people I talk to who have been in recovery, got in recovery through the syringe services program, going in there, and then they would be like, Grace, that's the director now, I'd be like, oh, Grace, help me get in, and blah, blah, blah. So it makes sense in a way, even though it seems counterintuitive at first. They reduce infections like HIV and hepatitis C, obviously through helping people with access to sterile equipment. They also reduce overdose deaths. Safe Recovery distributed more than 20,000 doses of Narcan between 2013 and 2018. Before I came tonight, I Googled syringe services in Brattleboro, and it looks like there's one place on Grove Street that on Tuesdays between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. offers syringe services. So that's 4 hours a week. And I mean, when my sister was actively using drugs, she often didn't know like what month it was, let alone what day of the week, and oh, I have to be there at 10 a.m. for the 4-hour window that the syringe services program is open. And then what if you don't live in Brattleboro, you live in Vernon or, you know, Bellows Falls? What are you doing then? I think that even if you're not moved by this idea because it's a form of caring for people or healthcare, I think there's a really strong economic argument for it. And I'm not an economist, and I know that a lot of people are talking right now about, you know, the economics of the opioid epidemic. But, so my sister died of endocarditis, which, like I said, is an infection of the heart lining. Between 2013 and 2017, there was a 120% increase at UVM Medical Center of drug-related endocarditis. They actually think that that number is much, much higher. They, according to this, you know, medical center spokesperson I talked to, they don't code it very well. So there's a lot of cases of endocarditis that are probably drug-related, but they just didn't get entered into their system that way. But nonetheless, that's a huge increase. And according to the medical center, it costs between $100,000 and $600,000 to treat one case of endocarditis there. I met a woman in my reporting this year who was hospitalized. She had 2 different heart surgeries, you know, she's on Medicaid. This is extraordinarily expensive. So it costs between $100,000 and $600,000 to treat. The annual budget of Safe Recovery is $350,000. Like, you do the math. If you prevent one case of endocarditis over the course of a year, you pretty much paid for the budget of syringe services, not to mention all the people they've prevented from ODing, all of the other diseases that have been prevented. So the other form of harm reduction I'm going to talk about is supervised consumption sites. And these are places where people can go and use illegal drugs under medical supervision. Again, never heard of them while my sister was alive. And honestly, I think the idea of them would have terrified me at the time, because the idea of my sister injecting drugs terrified me. And it was really just the last thing that I wanted to think about. But me not thinking about it didn't stop it from happening. She was doing it anyway. And, you know, you all not thinking about it is not stopping it from happening. You know, people are injecting drugs in the library bathroom here, I have no doubt. They're, you know, in the alleys behind restaurants in downtown Brattleboro, in the woods by your house, in the stairwell of the parking garage. It's happening. So there's 120 supervised consumption sites in 10 countries around the world, mostly in Europe and Australia and Canada, and they're illegal in the United States. In spite of the fact that more than 100 peer-reviewed studies from around the world have shown that they basically do all the same. This is the exact same slide as the syringe services slide. You know, they increase the delivery of social and medical services. There's never been an OD at a supervised consumption site. They also save money, you know, in the reduction in disease, preventing overdose, the need for EMTs to respond to overdose, and they also reduce public disorder and increase public safety in the neighborhoods where they exist. So the only difference between this slide and this slide is the citation at the bottom. So this data I got from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is our nation's public health institution. And this is from the American Medical Association. And the only reason I point this out is because I just want to make it really clear that these aren't like left-wing fringe pro-drug groups. You know, the AMA is the largest association of doctors and med students in the US. And in 2017, they called for the pilot of supervised consumption sites in this country as a way to help stem this epidemic. When people talk about opposition to it, or I don't know, I saw this photo on the left, which is of Insight, which is a supervised consumption site in Vancouver. And on the right is a guy in a, I guess you would call it, unsupervised consumption site in Vancouver. He was using drugs next to a dumpster in an alley and OD'd, and these are some people who are reviving him with Narcan. I'm not sure why the one on the right is preferable to the one on the left. But I think for a lot of people it is. So the other thing that I think that supervised consumption sites do and syringe services programs do is that they tell people, we care about you. They provide these, like, you know, real public health services, but they also say to people, we love you, we care about you, we want you to live. You know, there's this saying, like, you can't recover if you're dead. My sister died of a completely preventable, treatable infection while she was incarcerated. That infection was not treated in part because of a fundamental lack of compassion on the part of individual correctional officers, and also a criminal justice system that just doesn't recognize that this is a disease. I mean, a culture that doesn't recognize largely that opioid use disorder is a disease. She was arrested, she asked again and again for help, and she didn't receive it till it was too late to save her life. When they finally brought her to the hospital, that infection had spread in a way that she could not be saved. This is a video of Maddie singing, and I kind of wanted everyone to see Maddie on, like, at her best.
Turn down the lights, turn down the bed, turn down these voices inside my head. Lay down with me and tell me no lies. Just hold me close and don't patronize. 'Cause I can make you love me if you don't. And you can make your heart feel something it won't. Here in the dark, in these final hours, I will lay down my heart and I'll feel the power. 'Cause you won't. No, you won't. 'Cause I can make you love me if you don't. I'll close my eyes and then I won't see the love that is there right in front of me. And I don't remember the rest of the words. Oh.
So, like I said, that was Maddie on one of her really good best days. And this was the photo of her that was printed with her obituary. That's her son on her back. Again, this is on Maddie. This is Maddie on a really, really good day. And I think that when that obituary went viral, this is a face that's really easy to empathize with, right? This is Maddie when she's well and at her best. I think it was a lot harder to empathize with Maddie when she was panhandling downtown or trying to scam you out of money. This is Maddie. This is her mugshot from when she was arrested in Springfield. And so I think this is the person that we have to have empathy for. This was the person that those correctional officers, those cops couldn't bring themselves to empathize with. So I think it's really important to look at these faces. So I'm going to end with a quote that somebody sent to me a couple months ago and that I really love. It's the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And so I've been thinking a lot about connection and just wondering what would happen if we all extended our hands and offered that connection, sort of the connection that my family got after my sister died and that obituary went viral. What if instead of stigmatizing and judging people with addiction, we loved and supported them? Even if they're not sober or trying to get sober. What if we viewed people in the throes of their addiction who are actively using drugs every day as people with the disease who are worthy of our love and support? Because that's what they are. What if we said to them, we as individuals and as a culture, we want you to be safe. We value your life and we want you to live. Here are the evidence-based tools you need to stay alive. And if and when you are ready to stop using drugs, we will help you do so because you are worth it. I fell in love with my sister Maddie in the hospital room where she was born, where I held her and kissed her, sang to her, and whispered my love in her ear, where I was so full of hope for her future and couldn't wait to bring her home. 11,148 days later, in a different hospital room, I again held her and kissed her. I sang to her and whispered my love in her ear. I was so full of hope for her future, and I could not wait to bring her home. What if we looked at people like Maddie when she was sick? And we extended our hands. And we said, we love you. We're right here. Hold on. That's all. Thank you. I made it so close without crying. I don't know if there's supposed to be a Q&A, but if anybody has any cues, I'm happy to answer them. That was kind of a dorky joke. Hi.
Hi. If she had periods of being, being okay, what would cause her to go back down the road again?
Yeah. So the question was, if she had periods where she was doing okay, what would cause her to relapse? And I think it was a variety of things. I think the last time, when she had her son and she was doing really well, her partner actually relapsed. And so I think that's really hard, if you're living with somebody who's using, and that was hard. I think, again, you can't really underestimate trauma. I think she had so much trauma and, literally PTSD and flashbacks and stuff. Again, I didn't understand that when she was alive, but now from talking to people who have experienced the kind of trauma she did, the way that I understand it is that it can be really, really impossible to live with unless you have pretty superb coping skills, and she hadn't developed those. So I think it was a lot of things. And then after she lost her son for the second time, and again, I think this is really common, she just spiraled, and I think from what I actually had a story published today for 7 days, and it's about DCF involvement and parents. And so many moms I talked to would, they would be kind of wobbly and they would relapse, and then DCF would lose their kids and they would just lose all hope and just spiral. So I think it was different things at different times. But I also think that it's hard to overestimate the physical aspect of this addiction. I think there's just kind of this I think she just, she would talk about how she just always wanted it.
Sad, it's very sad.
Yeah. Hi.
Your equation of 8 years plus 4 or 5 treatment attempts equals a year of sobriety. Where would, had your sister lived, do you know where she was in that equation?
I mean, she definitely wasn't average because she had been using heroin or opioids and the thing that's crazy, and I was hired to write about the opioid epidemic, but this is really a polysubstance epidemic. At the end of my sister's life, she was on methadone and she was using crack and meth, which is another huge problem that's coming to Vermont right now. But so she, I think she had been using opioids for about a decade, heroin, and she'd been to rehab dozens of times. So, but I think part of the problem is that she was literally cycling through the same 4 places. She was going to Brattleboro Retreat, she was going to Valley Vista, she was going to Serenity House and Maple Leaf before it closed. So, I mean, literally, it's the same programming every time. Nothing's different, and but so she was definitely above average in so many ways, but in that way too, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
You said that Maddie's son was special needs. Was that a birth defect brought on by opioid use during pregnancy?
No, actually, one of the things that I learned for the last story that I reported was that opioid use during pregnancy really doesn't cause birth defects that they know of. They haven't been able to make any, so like alcohol use disorder apparently. What is it called? Teratogenic? So we say teratogenic? Yeah, so that is teratogenic. So alcohol is, but opioids apparently are not. Cocaine is much harder on a fetus, and according to the doctors that I spoke to for the last story I reported, you know, it's the aspect of opioid use disorder that's really hard on a fetus is withdrawal and going back and forth. So no, there's no link between what her son, was diagnosed with and her opioid use disorder. But as, again, another thing I learned through the last story I reported is that people who have opioid use disorder and are pregnant also have all of these other issues around, like smoking is really high, nutrition issues, you know, like all these other instabilities that are affecting a pregnancy. But apparently, you know, medication-assisted treatment is the standard of care for pregnant women as well, and those are opioids, so. And thank you for whoever helped me with that hard word. Yeah.
I have one more question. I mean, I'm listening to you, and you hear she was your sister, and you're a wonderful person. What was the difference in the way you were brought up? What happened to her?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I think I was lucky in a lot of ways. I think we have different dads, and her dad comes from a family where there's substance use issues, so I think there is definitely a genetic component of it. But, you know, I think, I don't know. I mean, I've known people who are siblings and, you know, 3 kids in the family and 1 is addicted and 2 aren't, and, you know, it's just, who knows?
I wonder if hopefully they'll find out.
Yeah, I hope they do find out. Yeah. Did you have a question too?
I did. I was so surprised to hear that she hadn't been offered medication-assisted treatment when she had been in and out of rehab so many times. So even at the retreat, this wasn't?
Later she was, early on she wasn't, and she might have been at the retreat. You know, I don't know when she was at the retreat. You know what's actually funny? The first time, like the second time she went to rehab, we came down to go to Brattleboro retreat, and we got there, and like this was such an education to me on so many levels, because again, at the time I think I thought that like Maddie was using drugs to like get high and have fun, and then I was driving a detoxing person 2.5 hours across the state and was like shocked at how sick she was. She literally could not walk. And we got to Brattleboro and they were like, actually we gave away that bed, but go to the hospital and say you're suicidal and then we can give you a mental health bed. And then we went to the hospital and she said she was suicidal, and then they were like, actually that bed's gone, but now you've said you're suicidal and you're stuck with the hospital. I mean, it was so nuts. But so I don't think she ended up going to the retreat like until later. And a lot, like I know at Valley Vista, they were originally, like the first 1 or 2 times she went, they were giving her buprenorphine to detox, but then not recommending it. But then when they were, there was no one who would prescribe it. I mean, there was just no one who would prescribe it. And then she found, she was, I think, I don't know if you guys know about Fred Holmes, who was a pediatrician in St. Albans, and you know, that's where my mom's from, and she was a patient of Dr. Holmes, but she relapsed, and as soon as you relapsed at that time, you know, you got kicked out. Like there was just no, you know, or she didn't just relapse, she was like abusing her buprenorphine, and she, you know, so she lost her place there. You know, by the time, it was when she was pregnant when she got bumped to the top of the list, because there was still a wait list at that point, and that was the first time when she was able to regularly access medication. Yeah.
Hi. I just want to thank you just so sincerely for doing this and, you know, talking about this. Sorry, now I'm going to cry because, you know, there's certain ways that people don't understand. I'm trying to speak loud for everyone to hear. People don't understand or have an expectation that stuff like this is going on with people that look like you, that this is happening, And there's a way in which when there are families struggling with this that look like you, they're not going to talk about it. And they also don't often have to because they're shielded in a way because they're, you know, in a different part of society. So they're not as often arrested or put in the paper. So there's this way in which you're helping so much to defeat the stigma by just saying, hey, it also looks like this, just like you, just like, you know, so it's just really so important that people, you know, from all walks of life are showing this is happening to them, to their families, so that it isn't just like these people that other people feel like, well, those are people that aren't near and dear to me and they're throwaways and we don't care and we want to hide from them. So it's just helping so much. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thanks for saying that. And I mean, the one thing that does worry me about it is that this is getting so much attention now that people who look like Maddie are dying. I mean, I live in Philadelphia where this disease looks very, very different. And sorry about your mic. But I think that, you know, I think the key is like we have to have that empathy for people who don't look like us and people who, you know, don't look like us and like do not look good, like, you know, are very, very sick. And people, you know, she's like a freckle-faced, pretty white woman with a baby in a backpack. Like she's like the easiest person for you and I to empathize with, right? If we can't extend that empathy for people, and then the fact of the matter is that this disease is so complex. We're talking about opioid use disorder, but we need to be talking about poverty, and we need to be talking about generational poverty. And I mean, alcoholism like is so much more prevalent and killing so many more people, you know. So I do think we all need to be talking about it, but I think we need to be talking about it in all its forms and all of its faces.
I'm glad that you just said that, because I want to add to this conversation. My daughter died from a heroin overdose in 2005. And her partner, my son-in-law, took his life a year and a half ago. And their son, who I'm raising, is 16 now, and he has to deal with, you know, his mom died from heroin, his dad took his own life. Like, what a legacy that he has to carry. But I wanted to bring up that suicide is also like the highest rate that it's ever been. And in fact, I was listening to NPR that this year, last year's numbers, it was the first time that the lifespan trajectory has gone down 1%, gone down by one number. It's the first time in history that that has gone down. And it was because of the suicide rate going up so high. And for me, it has to do with connection, that people aren't feeling connected enough to want to live or to be able to get through these incredibly challenging things like addiction.
Yeah, I think it's like a Yale researcher who defines it. There's been a huge rise in, quote, deaths of despair. So deaths related to suicide, related to opioid addiction and alcohol, and that's why, you know, I think they think that number has gone down. So for whatever reason, people are, I think connection is a lot of it, right? You tend to despair less if you feel connected. Yeah.
So I want to thank you also for sharing this story, and you did it beautifully. You are a very good speaker.
Oh, thanks.
And in spite of your disclaimer, I think that Maddie's death sort of demonstrates how a loving family, a family that really loves that member so much, still can't necessarily prevent the death. And when you think about addiction, seems to be one of those problems that we have as human beings that doesn't respond respond to love the way a lot of other things do. No matter how much you love that person, unless you can figure out what things would really work, no matter how much love you give, it doesn't necessarily have to work. But she was very lucky. She was in a loving family and had a loving sister and parents while she was going through her struggles. So thank you for making your efforts and giving her that love.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
thanks.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, Maddie, it was a pleasure to love Maddie, and it was very easy even when she was at her worst. But one of the things that I've thought about is that, I just wish we had loved her differently. I wish we had known. I just remember her one time telling me how much she loved the feeling of a needle slipping into her arm, and I was so horrified. And at the time, like, she's telling me this really private thing that was really important to her, and I can't even imagine what the look on my face must have been. But I think now, like, what if I had reacted differently? Like, if I had even just said, like, that's kind of scary to hear, like, but what is it about that? Or, because that's the other thing. I've talked to so many people this year, like, the little secret is that for a lot of injection drug users, like, the injecting is a huge, I mean, she injected water when she was sober. So that's another addiction part of it. But I just think, like, I was so scared and so sort of frozen, and I think, like, what if I had been more open-hearted in the way that I loved her and accepted who she was in these moments where she was really, really sick, instead of being like, well, no, try to be like this, which we did because we were scared. But if instead we said, okay, if this is where you're going to be right now, here's some stuff.
Yeah, I just want to say that I appreciate your story. And I have a son who, about, 9 years of addiction, struggling with it, and in the beginning, came from a loving home, so what, for whatever reason he has an addiction, character, temperament, just life, adolescence. At any rate, and he's incarcerated now, again, and so a couple years ago they did not do MAT, now they do MAT in jail, so that's good. And they have some programs in there as well. But I think that I've learned over the last few years, and just, well, not even the last few years, just recently, how to talk to my son, or how, just how do you deal with an addiction instead of, wanting to control it and wanting to, you better do this, or I'm not going to let you in the house, all that kind of stuff. You have to reach out and really love them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's so much about the way that our culture treats addiction that even in treatment it's punitive. Like, I remember the first, like, real rehab Maddie went, it was so punitive. Like, my mom was talking about how they were making her carry her suitcase around and they were about to kick her out, like, all this stuff. And rules and structure are really important, but I think there are these ways in which there's this idea of, like, you have to hit bottom. Like, well, I guess so. Like, really? Like, why? Why can't we just, help people before they're in that place? And, yeah.
I don't understand that at all. Why would you want to just make praise them when they were good and kind of fly over the place when they were bad?
Yeah. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, go ahead.
What I've learned is that this is a mental illness. And the thinking goes along with it. They aren't going to make decisions the same way that someone who is not an addict. They don't think the same way. And it's out of your control. You had no control, so you did nothing wrong. You could not have
Don't
changed
tell me
it.
that.
And you do that many years after someone dies. You blame, why didn't I, you remember the exact instant where you could have said something different.
Yeah.
And it happens anyway. And to remember that it is a mental illness, and you cannot love a person into getting help or being better. It's still a mystery. I'm so glad they have changed. They are just starting to change, where it's not punitive. Because back when my partner was getting help in 1985, it was all about, and they grabbed a hold of me, and I'm the one who had to make all the changes. And oh my gosh. And the great thing, I lost a lot of weight because I was a nervous wreck walking on eggshells. But I finally figured it out. Just do the opposite of what I feel like doing. That's the right thing. Because there is this dance, they call it a dance, that you, after many years of living with it, when he does this, you do this. When you do this, he does this, So you just have to do the opposite of what you feel like doing. When you feel like killing them, you have to be kind. And when you feel like letting them go, being kind, that's when you be firm, and it's, but even after all that, I didn't have any control. You seem to want it, but you don't. That's
And
my 2 cents.
I agree that, like, we as individuals can't love somebody into health or away from addiction, but I think we as a culture can, right? Like, so if we completely change the way that we treat addiction, and I think we as a culture can love people into wellness instead of treating them punitively, instead of judging them, changing these systems, providing harm reduction, whatever it is. I mean, I think those are a form of love. So that's how I think that we can love people into health and out of these really dark places. Yeah.
So what are the obstacles to our getting more syringe service programs? I assume they're political, and
I think that's one of the things that the state is behind, the supervised injection. They're definitely not into in Vermont, or even really talking about. Sarah George, the district attorney in Vermont, is talking about it a lot. She's for it, but I think a lot of it's money. But I was with Mark Levine, who's the health commissioner, at something recently, and he actually seemed to think that we have a lot of health syringe services, and we do if you look at it in that, there are syringe services in Brattleboro, but there really, kind of effectively aren't. But I think it's a matter of dollars and how to invest them, and when people are looking at how to do this, this seems like not one of the top ways. Yeah.
I think, to add on to what you're saying there, so I'm on the Brattleboro Select Board, and my office is also, where I do my actual work, is next door to the AIDS Project, and I'm there on a Tuesday when folks are coming in to use the syringe program. And I've talked with the folks there, and it's not only a question of money. There are some more complex things, and I guess I would say, if any of you were moved by the information about how syringe programs like the one that is run through the AIDS Project, I would say, really support that organization. We could also support it as a town. We will probably get a request from them as part of the Human Services funding. So if you're a town meeting member, that's something to consider when town meeting rolls around. And the town is just about to embark on its budgeting process for the year. So if these kinds of things are important to you, they are entirely appropriate to talk about over the next few months as we're working out the budget to present at town meeting. And I think that even talking, you alluded to it there, even talking about safe use sites, supervised safe use sites, having that conversation in town and preparing people for at least entertaining the notion that actually that might be helpful in reducing harm and improving the lives of many, many people in our town, not only people who are using drugs.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think that, the other thing that all of these things do is, they provide a distinct service, but I think having Narcan in your pocket also says to, people like your son, if that person's addicted, I'm going to take care of you, I have your back. And I think as a community saying, okay, we have a syringe services program here and it has good hours, because they don't just provide, clean works. They also provide, they do casework. They help, the people I know who went to safe recovery got help, legal stuff, housing stuff. It's a really wide array of services. And these are people who are often so far at the fringes, they don't go anywhere else. They don't see anyone else. This is the one place that they go. So these are people who, cost the system a lot of money and can be, save the system a lot of money by using this as a way to help them come in from the cold, really. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it.